Hello and welcome to Need to Know, the programme that keeps you up to date on the big issues in the world of education. In this programme, we look at recent legislation that clarifies when and how teachers have the power to intervene when faced with dangerous or disruptive situations in school. Here to explain your rights and what you need to consider when exercising them is Mike Baker.
Thank you, Sheena. Well, it's every teacher's worst nightmare. An altercation between two groups of pupils in a busy corridor escalates and a member of staff intervenes, grabbing the arm of the ringleader, a known and violent bully, to restrain him from causing serious injury to others. Once further trouble is averted, the police are contacted, an allegation of assault is made, and an investigation is launched. But here's where the nightmare starts. It's not the violent pupil in the dock, but the teacher. He's accused by the pupil's parents of striking their child. That's exactly what happened to Ray Tarleton, a head teacher from Devon. He was eventually cleared when the Crown Prosecution Service dropped the assault charge against him, but only after the embarrassment and stress of a serious and very public accusation. It was a terrible ordeal for him and just the sort of case that has caused real uncertainty amongst teachers about their powers to intervene. Indeed, it was this sort of confusion that led the government to ask Sir Alan Steer, head of a large comprehensive just outside London, to lead a task force on discipline in schools. His group's report made a raft of recommendations, which included the creation of a new law defining clearly a teacher's power to intervene and forcibly restrain where necessary. The government were quick to support Steer's plan, and the law now clarifies exactly where teachers stand.
Before we talk about that detail, the clarification, what was the law like before?
Well, in the past, it was all very much based on a combination of case law and common law, and there was the expectation that teachers were in loco parentis, in other words, in the role of parents, and therefore could use the same amount of powers to discipline or restrain where necessary as parents could in the home. But the trouble is, that was never really absolutely tested in law, and there was some doubt about that. And also what was growing up was a sense of, that the pupils and indeed parents saying, you can't touch me or you can't touch my child. So there's a sense that needed to be clarified. Let's listen now to Anita Chopra, an education lawyer.
Section 93 of the Education and Inspections Act 2006 has made the powers of restraint explicit for teachers, basically made it legal for them to use reasonable force to discipline and maintain discipline within schools. Before the Act came into force, which was prior to April 2007, they had the same rights as parents under common law to use reasonable force, if you like, but I don't think in practical realities it was actually being utilised. But now the Act has made this legally possible for them.
So now we have new law. Who will it give power to?
Well, indeed, the Act introduced for the first time a statutory power for teachers and certain other school staff, including, for example, teaching assistants, midday supervisors and learning mentors, to discipline pupils. These powers apply in school and when pupils are out of school but under teacher supervision, for example, on a school trip. More controversially, they also extend beyond the school premises in other circumstances. Now, the law grants the right to use reasonable force as a last resort in order to restrain or control pupils if they are or are about to be committing a criminal offence, at risk of injuring themselves or others, damaging property, acting in a way that is counter to the maintenance and good order, a discipline. Now, it's important to be clear that this is not a return to corporal punishment. These powers function alongside every citizen's common law right to self-defence in a case of emergency. In those circumstances, a degree of force, not just reasonable force, might be appropriate.
And sadly, but realistically, we now see weapons in the classroom. Does the law cover that?
Yes, there's a different law, in fact, which has come in on that, and that says that head teachers now have the right to either themselves or to give authority to others to search for weapons. Now, that might be putting up those arches or using those electronic wands to see whether or not anyone is carrying a weapon. But that's a separate law, but it's the same sort of new power for them.
Now, let's go on to the clarification. There are two key words, discipline and restraint. Let's start with discipline. Who has the power to discipline?
Well, really anybody that the head teacher decides to give power to. So, as I said, that obviously would include teachers, but it could include anybody else working in the school, but also it could include those who are volunteering. So, for example, a parent helping out on a school trip or helping out alongside on a sports event. Anybody that the head teacher has explicitly given powers to.
You mentioned this controversy about extending those powers beyond the school gates. Why?
Yes, because that is really quite a change. It's been a very grey area before, and I think some teachers are a bit worried about what risks might be involved. Let's listen to John Bangs of the National Union of Teachers.
It actually, for the first time, codifies teachers' legal right to discipline. It also, in a very important grey area in the past, codifies the ability and the powers of the head teacher to intervene outside school. For instance, if children or young people are mucking around on the top of the school bus, you can actually, if you believe that the school's reputation, the public safety is being endangered, intervene as a head teacher and discipline children for doing that. So I think the legislation is very important in that, for the first time, parents, for example, or the individual stroppy parent can't say to the head teacher, "You can't do this to my child." Well, oh yes, I can. Actually, I do have that legal power in terms of detention, for example. So I think it's about codifying and providing a backdrop for teachers' disciplinary powers.
The other category is restraint with a subsection compliance. Explain.
Yes, and this is an area where there are two occasions where you might need to use this. One is if the child is in danger of hurting themselves or somebody else, and then you can use restraint there. Or if they're refusing to comply with an instruction, for example, to leave the classroom when they're being very disruptive. And again, you can use restraint there.
I have to say, using force does sound like corporal punishment.
It does, and this is where we have to be very careful to distinguish. This is not using force as a punishment. This is using force where you need to, for restraint reasons, to avoid danger to other people or to make sure something is carried out.
Reasonable restraint, you mentioned earlier. Reasonable is a very fluid word. I mean, what does it actually mean?
That's the difficulty. Although this has been a really good attempt to try and make things clear for teachers to know what they can and can't do, in the end, things like reasonable and proportionate will still be down to lawyers. Let's listen again to a lawyer, education lawyer, Anita Chopra.
I think this is the million-dollar question as to what is meant by reasonable force in the legal world, because the test of reasonableness has always been one that's very, very difficult to define. It is dependent upon the circumstances on the individual case, the incident that's occurred, the seriousness of it, how much force should be used to stop the child doing what they're being accused of doing, whether it's violent weapons are involved or whether it's pushing a child or spitting at a teacher. I mean, it's going to have a wide range of circumstances that need to be considered. And it's got to be proportionate. I think that's the main thing. Whatever the incident is and whatever force is used to stop the incident, I think it needs to be proportionate.
It's complex. Teachers must be worried.
Yes, I think they need some sort of guidance on this. Indeed, fortunately, there is guidance. So that DCSF guidance stresses that decisions about whether to use force must be reasonably made. Now, of course, such decisions are usually made quickly and with little time to reflect. Nevertheless, the guidance suggests that staff should consider the seriousness of the incident, assessed by the effect of the injury, damage or disorder which is likely to result if force is not used, the chances of resolving the issue by other means, the relative risks of physical intervention compared with using other strategies. Now, the guidance gives a number of examples where a member of staff might consider forcible restraint. They include a pupil attacks a member of staff or another pupil, pupils are fighting, a pupil is committing or about to commit deliberate damage to property, and a pupil is behaving in a way that seriously disrupts a lesson. In these cases, force would be reasonable and therefore lawful, if it was clear that the behaviour was sufficiently dangerous or disruptive to warrant the physical intervention, assuming that it could not be realistically dealt with by any other means.
You keep using the word force. What sort of force are teachers able to use?
Well, the key words, once again, are reasonable and proportionate. So it's about assessing what the situation is and deciding what is reasonable that you need to use there. And indeed, we've got someone here who can tell us about just that. And with me now is Tim Cook, who trains teachers in how to handle these situations. Tim, welcome. Now, let's just be clear about this right from the beginning. This is something that people are going to need training on, aren't they? It's not just enough to read the guidelines.
No, they need to work it out in their own context. And I think particularly staff working in schools need to know what the school expects them to do, what the interpretation of the national guidance might be in their setting. And then based on that, the training may say, well, we need to look at aspects of de-escalation, conflict management, and it might in some cases look at physical intervention as well. OK, now we've got Arthur here, who I'm sure normally is extremely well behaved, but it's going to be a little bit awkward for us today. What's the very first thing that you would do once you start to see that there's a problem with Arthur complying with the instructions? Yeah, I'm going to stand back and look. I'm going to stand back and assess and make sure that I'm going to work out whether or not I need to intervene at all. And if I do need to intervene, whether it's going to be safe for me to do that on my own or whether or not I need to call for additional assistance. And again, if he's not doing what I want him to do, I'm not going to rely on physical intervention first of all. I'll ask him to stop.
So a little bit of distance first, try not to escalate the situation.
That's right.
But OK, that's not worked. Let's say, what are you going to do next?
OK, well, if I need to move in closer to Arthur to give him some kind of prompt, I'm going to look at my positioning relative to him. I'm going to try not to be square on to him in a threatening sort of posture. And I'm going to try and move in close into this sort of position, sideways on, but also having my hands in a position where hopefully they're non-threatening, but they're also in a position to protect me in case he's startled and tries to strike out or grab out at me.
So sideways on is important, is it? But, OK, he's still not obeying, and what do you do next? OK,
well, if I need to use a physical prompt, I'm going to grasp hold using a cradle guide here at the elbow. And I can just begin to... It's more of an assessment touch. You can see I can encourage him to move, but he doesn't actually want to move his feet.
Doesn't seem to want to move at all, no.
No. So at this point, I may escalate. I may move up into a more secure hold and come round the back and just use 2 cradles here. If he starts moving around, I can try and adjust my position relative to him. And I've got quite a bit of stability and safety over this kind of position.
And by having both hands there, you can sort of avoid the flailing around.
That's right.
Let's say that's still not working. It hasn't calmed down. Is still, very upset and potentially aggressive. What's the next step up from that?
Well, we're starting off in this cradle guide, and of course the risk here will be that he can spin round.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to move from this kind of position, and I'm going to get a bit of security round on this far arm. You can see that I've hooked over this arm as well. And now at this point, I can keep the situation safe. Of course, what I've got to remember with Arthur is that he's pretty much on the boundaries of what I might want to do in terms of working on my own. So another possibility would be just to call for assistance.
And that's an important point, isn't it? At some stage, you've got to make an assessment to call somebody else in.
Yes.
What about, what if do you have to be big and strong? What about female teachers, for example? Not that they aren't all sometimes strong.
Well, I'm not big or strong, but I'm the size that I am, and I think it's important that people should know what their limits are. I think if you've got appropriately trained techniques and if you feel confident in those, people can be surprised by how you can use body mechanics rather than strength to give you safety.
Teachers, of course, not completely on their own in this sort of thing, are they?
No, there's people out there who can provide support, and also there's the guidance which we must be going back to, but there's a wealth of advice.
And they couldn't necessarily just take what they've seen here and put that straight into action. You're saying that it needs more than that. It's quite subtle, this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of subtlety around this, not least in terms of people's risk assessment, so they can understand when to intervene, but also in terms of applying the mechanics. And it's really important that people should be adequately trained.
And just finally, briefly, do you think this is actually an improvement on where we were? Do you think teachers want to have a little bit more confidence about what they can do?
Yeah. Teachers are crying out for clarity in this area. I think it's really important, and I welcome the guidance.
OK, well, Tim Cook, thanks very much. Arthur, thank you for being here and having to be restrained. And I think, actually, it will be a lot of help to teachers. So thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, that was clear enough, but some parents may not like their violent children being disciplined or restrained. What advice are schools being given on that?
Well, the really key thing is they must involve parents right from the very beginning so they know what's coming along. They must publish their discipline policy and discuss it with pupils and parents. But I'm sure still we'll find that some of these things will have to be settled in the courts.
Thanks very much, Mike. That's all we have time for in this programme. You can find out more information on teachers' powers on our website. Join us next time when Mike will tell you all you need to know on another of the big topics in education. Goodbye.